So I want to just close with some, what I'd call some parting comments that were sort of overall reflections, then invite Kate Love up to the chair to give me a grilling about some questions, and hopefully they'll be fun questions, and then we'll get to a close. We'll look forward to staying on the right time track. I guess from terms of the overall macro first, I thought that actually the first two opening sessions were the most important sessions of the entire conference because they set the theme of what I would encourage investors to think about. The first one was China, and the second one was resource nationalism. And I know those of you who have been to conferences before saying, oh, those are boring, I've heard them. They were talking about those 5 years ago, you're talking about those 10 years ago. But they're still the two most important questions that you should be asking as an investor. China still makes a difference. It is still the driver of price formation, and it's still the driver of winners and losers amongst those commodities. It was only 2012, 2013 when the big debate was going to be soft landing versus hard landing. We've gotten past that debate. Chinese policymakers have figured out and successfully navigated to a soft landing. And they figured out roughly that soft landing can be handled on a sustainable basis. And most important for our sector, they figured out how to do that and also focus on the individual Chinese quality of life. And that's actually having huge effect, on balance, positive for our sector. And if you go back 5 years ago, and John, you didn't point this out, but I'm going to point this out for you. If you go back to your own probably economic scenarios of 5 years ago for where China could have gone, we're probably actually sitting in the best case of those economic scenarios. Because most people would have had something that would look like where we are now as the best case, and a lot of much, much worse cases as a likely outcome. So we take that for granted. We worry about a lot of other things, but one thing we're not worrying about is that Chinese deep, deep recession, Chinese going into negative GDP growth with social instability and all the other chaos that certainly would have on our business. John, as you point out, other economies are important. I've spent the past 4 years in India, and I've made comments into Mining Journal presentations about China versus India, but they're still not the dominant. It is China that's the dominant theme. So for me, for investors, the two most important questions are, will China stay this course? And number two, where is China net long versus net short on metals? Daniel Litvin's comments, I think, were equally important, but they were scarier. Giant, you had sort of a positive sort of outlook of where the industry is going, a best case, but I fear we're moving toward the worst case in terms of the scenarios we could have envisioned 5 years ago where it's going for resource nationalism. Back in 2011, 2012, again, resource nationalism was getting scary. We were starting to see every economy, OECD, emerging alike, beginning to do bad things to the miner and the mining investor. But then when the markets dropped off, that cooled right off. We're hearing a lot of comments saying we're still at early days of this cycle, but we're actually at a tougher place on resource nationalism on balance now today than we were during the peak, during the last price cycle. And I do think it's going to get worse, and particularly in some of these African nations where they're seeing success. In some of the countries, even right-minded governments are saying, I have no choice from my electorate but actually go after the companies and tap into some of that money, which my electorate feels we're not taking. So that makes it hard. A new mine, big new mine, probably takes 2 to 5 years to discover, to get taken away. After you've discovered it, it may take 10 years, 5 to 10 years to develop it, and it may get taken away. Probably not at that stage because their money is being invested in. But then it probably takes about 20 years to make what is a decent investor return. And those 20 years are a place at risk. So as you as investors, you've got to ask yourself, how will I justify that investment to take a mining company, support it through that sequence, and be there to reap the dividends? So I have 3 questions and 3 investor takeaways I'd leave you with in that. And then I would say, I heard the term very beginning in the sessions yesterday, the soft subjects: employee health and safety, environment, water, air, communities where you have ex-UNICEF officials or ex-care officials out in the community try to engage. These are seen as, oh, that's not the serious stuff. Not the serious stuff until something goes wrong. Then all of a sudden it's at the CEO's desk and it's on the board's agenda. So I would say that those soft subjects should be asked about with equal vigor as you ask, what's the company's financial, the engineering, and the technical capabilities. Because they're going to be equally important as we go forward. And by the way, that is a great angle for improving the diversity of each of your businesses. The second is that it used to be, well, as long as you're doing okay, the country you're in is okay. But now I think picking the right country to invest is as important as picking the right commodity in your portfolio. And the third is a silver lining in that cloud. And that is that less money is going to get invested in the sector. And those mines that are there are going to take longer to get developed. And maybe not in this cycle, may take 2 or 3 cycles, as we've seen some of the other projects today. So what that will do, it will restrict capital. And even if there's enthusiasm, exuberance, you're not going to see the oversupply risk. It's still there, but it's going to be actually greatly diminished as a consequence of the fact that stakeholders are going to keep it from happening. And you as investors may say, well, maybe not right now. So it's bad for the individual projects if you're on the wrong side of that. It's good if you're on the right side of it and you actually see that the sector doesn't get oversupplied. So moving on to picking the right commodity, the biggest issue we heard over the past couple days was not on the table 5 years ago. 5 years ago, we forget that actually global warming was out of fashion politically. In those last years of the Obama administration, I remember some of the best thinkers on global warming saying to me, Tom, he won't be able to carry through his global warming agenda in his last part of his term because he doesn't have Congress behind him. Cap and trade disappeared. None of that stuff was on the agenda. And where are we now? It's as if we've been talking about global warming for the past 50 years. We've only been talking about it seriously for 3 years. And you're seeing the internal combustion engine is dead, oil is dead, coal is dead, and by the way, we're still heating up the planet too quickly. That is a huge shift, and it's leading to a huge shift in terms of the demand profile of our sector and also the winners and losers. And we heard a lot of winners and losers, but it's not as simple and straightforward as that. Clearly, the big winner in this is going to be the battery metals. But those battery metals are going to be subject to investment enthusiasm and exuberance. And it's also going to be subject to engineers and boards of auto companies saying, I don't want to put all my risk in cobalt in the DRC. Engineer, get that cobalt out of the formulation. You say you can't do it today, tell me you can do it 30 days from now. And they're going to work on that. Lithium, I know as a geologist, the former head of exploration, there's actually lots of lithium out there. I'm not saying it's easy to get out, but there is geologically lots of lithium out there. Copper is clearly a demand winner. And clearly from a supply side, it's going to be tough to get the new copper resources as the existing mines are maturing and they're fading down. But just a couple years ago, the contrarian view was that copper was a good product to be in. I can't go anywhere in the US, in Europe, or anywhere in the world where not every single person in the room is a copper bull. When every single person in the room is a copper bull, that's sort of like cryptocurrencies at $17,000 a coin. So just remember, over-exuberance for too long a time does actually create a risk of disruption. So we had a good presentation about one of the losers, which is coal. Not presentation, but a reminder that that's the big elephant in terms of the investment room. Who's going to invest in coal in this? Who's going to manage coal? Who's going to go in and choose coal as a career? It looks like it's just shrinking. But I think we should remind ourselves that as it shrinks, it will shrink, less money will go in, it will probably become more concentrated. And the suppliers that emerge from that will probably have more pricing power. A couple years ago, I remember telling my team, I said, will coal be the next tobacco? And I think coal is becoming the next tobacco. But remember, the only ones that love tobacco are the investor. They've been reaping tremendous dividends with existential threats for 20 years. So you could see coal that follow down that exact same path. It's another silver lining to that dark cloud. And again, silver in here should be somewhere in terms of the winners and losers. With all that uncertainty, how should the investor respond? And I liked what Rick said earlier today. And I'll just sum up just as well as I can in much, much fewer words. And that is, I heard that. All of you as investors like to say that you're acting and deciding only on the basis of facts and figures. But at the end of the day, emotions, including fear and greed, are always getting in the way. You do need to separate the wheat from the chaff. You worry about things like trade wars one moment, but you forget about the 2 billion people that want to live like you the next moment. And I would agree with Rick that markets work over the long term, and the highs are getting higher, the lows are getting higher at the same time. But these emotions and the information flow is actually creating even greater cycles and even more volatility and more drama in those cycles. So you've got to work with that. And not a single economist in the world will give you a forward projection that includes that cycle effect. They'll say, for the next 5 years, the price will be flat. Don't believe that. So, assuming you have the patience and staying power to know when to stand aside, as Rick said, and when to invest, as Rick said, the next questions for the investor is how to pick the winners and the losers, both on the uptick and the ones who thrive on the downturn. And the 3 takeaways I had from the meetings, the sessions this morning, including a great group session, was that the quality of the resource will still matter and should be able to navigate the cycle and grow as needed. So picking weak commodities or weak projects will give you some pleasure at some points, but you may not survive the other points. Increasingly, successful minds are starting with smaller capital. And I actually think there's a more alignment between the capital, or between the slow pace of development and the stakeholders who would rather probably have a less disruptive mine that lasts for a longer period of time. You don't hear anyone talking about NPV, and you shouldn't anymore. And you should only ask about IRR and payback periods. Management, their track record, and for me, the teams behind that top management actually will be the ones that will make the right portfolio picks, or more likely to make the right portfolio picks, more likely to pick the right exploration successes, and more likely to manage their teams through this cyclic area, and also through the tough challenges that we're increasingly going to be facing on resource nationalism. Ideas can make a difference. We didn't hear enough about that today. I'm glad we finished with technology, and there's only 1 or 2 presentations that we actually heard much about new ideas. And by the way, the one that caught me as new ideas were the PE and the Royal companies. That's been the only real disruptive idea we've seen in this sector for the past couple of years. And also, by the way, they're the only ones that made money in the past couple of years. So thank you. Those are my sort of reflecting points. Kate, it's up to you to grill me now.